The summer of 1941 began with the deafening roar of engines, marching boots, and the steel of thousands of tanks cutting across the horizon of Eastern Europe. In the early morning of June 22nd, 1941, in 1999, Nazi Germany launched the massive invasion of the Soviet Union known as Operation Barbarossa. It was the beginning of the largest military invasion in history. More than 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border on a front that stretched for thousands of kilometers. At the forefront were elite divisions of Wehrmacht, supported by tanks, heavy artillery, and aircraft air that roared in the sky. For many of those men, it seemed like the beginning of yet another quick campaign, like the ones in Poland or France. The German generals firmly believed that the enemy would fall within a few months. The plan was simple: advance quickly, destroy the Soviet army in the first few weeks, and capture the major cities before winter arrived. For many officers, the war would end before the snow even began to fall, and the soldiers believed it. Young recruits, hardened veterans, and seasoned officers marched with almost arrogant confidence. Many carried only basic combat equipment: rifle, ammunition, light backpack, and uniforms made for summer weather. There was little concern about extreme cold. In the minds of German planners, the Russian winter was something distant, a problem that simply wouldn't exist, because the war would end before then. On the dusty border roads, endless columns of trucks advanced, raising clouds of dust. Tanks sped past like steel monsters, crushing fences and farmland. Soldiers perched atop the armored vehicles waved, laughed, and even posed for photographs. Many believed they were marching toward inevitable victory. At first, everything seemed to confirm that confidence. Soviet defenses were struck with devastating force. Air bases were destroyed. Thousands of Soviet soldiers were surrounded, and huge columns of prisoners began appearing on the roads. The German advance seemed unstoppable. Within days, German armies had penetrated deep into Soviet territory. But while the maps on the generals' desks showed lines advancing rapidly eastward, the reality on the ground was beginning to show something different. The Soviet Union was gigantic. Distances that seemed small on the map turned into weeks of marching. Bad roads destroyed vehicles, supply convoys grew longer and more vulnerable. Yet, in that hot summer of 1941, almost no one stopped to think about it. Confidence was so high that few soldiers wondered what would happen if the war dragged on for months. Nobody was talking about snow. No one talked about temperatures that could kill a man in a few hours. No one imagined that, in a few months, those same soldiers would be fighting not only against a human enemy, but against something far more cruel: the Soviet winter. At that moment, however, marching under the summer sun, with dust covering their uniforms and the sound of engines echoing across the plains, the men of the Wehrmacht believed they were marching toward a swift victory. They didn't know they were walking directly into one of the greatest nightmares in the history of warfare: the long march through the wasteland. In the early days of the invasion, the German advance seemed almost impossible to stop. Armored columns advanced like steel blades cutting through Soviet territory. Tanks rolled along the roads, trucks loaded with soldiers kicked up clouds of dust, and heavy artillery followed close behind. For many soldiers, it seemed like just another quick campaign. The feeling was that they were crossing an already defeated enemy. But the reality of Soviet vastness began to appear very quickly, as the German armies penetrated ever deeper into the territory of Soviet Union. The distances became daunting. On the map, advancing 50 or 100 kilometers seemed simple. On the ground, that meant entire days marching under the sun, crossing destroyed roads, abandoned fields, and silent villages that seemed to have been hastily abandoned. The Soviets were retreating, but they weren't simply fleeing. They were burning everything. Before abandoning a city, Soviet units would set fire to food depots, blow up bridges, destroy railway tracks, and sabotage roads. Entire granaries were burned so that nothing would remain for the invaders. Wells were poisoned. Warehouses were emptied or destroyed. This brutal strategy became known as the scorched earth policy. For the German soldiers, this began to turn into a logistical nightmare. Supply convoys had to travel ever greater distances to deliver food, fuel, and ammunition to the front lines. Trucks traveled hundreds of kilometers on poor or virtually non-existent roads. Many vehicles broke down along the way. Others simply got stuck on narrow dirt tracks that could barely support the weight of the convoys. The war that the generals had planned as a sprint began slowly to turn into a long, exhausting march. The soldiers walked for hours and hours every day. Boots kicked up dust on the dry summer roads. Heavy backpacks pressed against their shoulders. The constant sound of engines and artillery echoed across the endless plains of Russia. And the territory seemed endless. Wheat fields stretched to the horizon. Dense forests concealed back roads and small villages. Wide rivers had to be crossed using makeshift wooden bridges under enemy fire. At night, many soldiers set up makeshift camps on the sides of the roads. Some slept inside trucks. Others simply lay on the ground, using backpacks as pillows. The summer heat was still present, but fatigue was already beginning to accumulate. Meanwhile, thousands of horses pulled heavy artillery and supply wagons. Despite being a modern army, much of German logistics still depended on animals. These horses marched day after day, often carrying absurdly heavy loads. Some simply dropped dead in the middle of the road, exhausted. When this happened, the soldiers would simply push the carcass to the side of the road and continue advancing. But there was something even more unsettling. The further the Germans advanced, the more empty the territory seemed. Abandoned villages, houses with open doors, pots still on cold stoves, toys left scattered in the yards. In many places, it seemed as if the people had disappeared just hours before the soldiers arrived. It was like crossing a ghost country. The silence of these abandoned regions was beginning to cause unease among many men. They knew the Soviet army was retreating, but they also knew that millions of soldiers were still scattered across that vast territory, and each kilometer advanced made the supply lines longer, more fragile and more vulnerable. The officers still believed in a quick victory. On the maps, the arrows continued to advance eastward. New cities were marked as conquered every day, but on the battlefield, marching under the sun and breathing dust, the soldiers were already beginning to sense that this campaign would not be as simple as they had promised. The earth seemed endless, and they were still only at the beginning of their journey. The autumn of Lama, a Rasputitsa summer, slowly began to fade on the horizon of war. The days were still long, but the heat was no longer the same. The wind began to blow colder across the eastern plains, and the first autumn rains began to fall on Russia's endless dirt roads. At first, nobody paid much attention. Some rain didn't seem like much to an army that had crossed half of Europe, but in the vastness of Soviet Union, the weather had its own rules that few German soldiers truly understood. And then it began. It rained for days, then for weeks. The dirt roads, which during the summer kicked up dust under the boots and wheels of vehicles, slowly began to transform into something completely different. The earth absorbed the water until it could hold on tight. The ground became heavy, dark, and sticky. Therefore, the roads disappeared. What were once firm paths now turned into a deep sea of mud. A thick, cold, and treacherous mud that swallowed wheels, boots, and even entire vehicles. This phenomenon was known to the Russians for centuries, the Rasputitsa, the famous mud station. For the German army, that was a brutal shock. Trucks carrying fuel and ammunition began to get stuck up to their axles. Drivers accelerated desperately, but the wheels just spun, spreading mud everywhere. The more they tried to get out, the deeper the vehicles sank. Heavy tanks, which during the summer had advanced like unstoppable machines, now struggled to move even a few meters. The tracks turned slowly, battling against the mud that clung like cement. In many cases, soldiers had to get out of the vehicles and try to push them manually. Men covered in mud up to their knees forced heavy trucks while officers shouted orders in the constant rain. It was often useless. Entire vehicles were simply abandoned on the roads. The heavy artillery faced an even worse problem. Most of the cannons were horse-drawn, and those animals now had to cross paths that looked more like swamps. Horses slipped. They fell. They tried to get up while pulling on tons of metal strapped to them. Many simply couldn't. Exhausted and trapped in the mud, some horses broke their legs trying to free themselves. Others collapsed to the ground, breathing heavily, until they finally stopped. Moving, soldiers, often with no choice, had to cut the harnesses and abandon the bodies right there. The roads began to transform into corridors of destruction. Broken carts, trucks stuck in the mud, tanks stalled, dead horses, equipment scattered across miles of mud. But the worst was yet to come. For the soldiers marching on foot, the situation was equally dire. Each step required effort. Boots sank deep into the heavy mud. In some places, the mud reached up to the shins. Walking a few kilometers could take hours. Uniforms were soaked. Cold water penetrated their clothes and boots. The autumn wind cut through the soldiers' wet bodies. The German advance, which months earlier had seemed like an unstoppable avalanche, slowly began to slow down. Entire districts remained virtually immobile for days, waiting for vehicles to be removed from the mud or for the roads to dry out, something that seemed never to happen. Meanwhile, the Soviet soldiers, more accustomed to that terrain, began to use the chaos to their advantage. Small attacks emerged in the forests, ambushes took place on the muddy roads, and isolated German units began to feel the pressure. The army that had begun the campaign believing in a quick victory was now facing a completely different enemy. It wasn't an army, it was the land itself. And while the men struggled against the mud, time continued to pass. Winter was drawing ever closer, the first sign of true winter, while German soldiers were still struggling to cross the hellish mud of Rasputitsa. Something began to slowly change in the air. At first, it was almost imperceptible. The mornings became quieter. The wind began to blow colder across the plains, and a white mist began to cover the fields at dawn. That was the first warning. Winter was coming. In late October and early November 1941, the rains began to subside. The mud, which for weeks had paralyzed vehicles and men, slowly began to harden as the temperature dropped. During the night, the ground surface froze. In the morning, the soldiers found the ground covered by a thin layer of ice. At first, that even seemed like good news. With the ground frozen, trucks and tanks were finally able to move again. Some roads that had previously been swamps were now firm. German officers believed this would allow them to resume their advance toward the campaign's major objectives, especially the Soviet capital, Moscow. But that hope was short-lived. The cold continued to intensify. Each day seemed a little colder than the last. The wind cut through exposed skin. The soldiers' breath turned into white clouds in the air. Puddles froze overnight, forming sheets of ice that crackled under their boots in the morning. And then came the first snow. It wasn't yet a brutal storm, but small snowflakes began to fall slowly across the plains. At first, many soldiers watched almost with curiosity. Some even smiled as they saw the white landscape forming over the war-torn fields. But the cold continued to fall. Temperatures began to reach levels that few of those men had experienced before. 10 degrees below zero, then 15. On some nights, the thermometer dropped even lower. The problem was that the German army simply wasn't prepared for that. Most soldiers were still wearing the same uniforms they had worn during the summer and early autumn. Heavy winter coats were still far away, tucked away in supply lines that stretched for hundreds and hundreds of kilometers behind the front lines. The boots weren't made for that extreme climate either. The leather stiffened in the cold. The moisture froze inside the fabric. Many soldiers spent entire days with wet, freezing feet inside their boots. The nights began to become particularly cruel. Without adequate shelter, many soldiers slept in shallow trenches, holes in the ground or inside vehicles. Some tried to light small fires to keep warm, but this was often too dangerous, as the smoke could reveal their positions to the enemy, so they just endured the cold. Thin blankets were insufficient to cope with sub-zero temperatures. Some soldiers tried to sleep huddled together to share body heat. Others used pieces of tarpaulin, hay, or any material they could find to try to protect themselves from the icy wind. Even so, the cold seemed to penetrate everything. He was going through clothes, gloves, boots, and blankets. During the night, ice was beginning to form on the edges of the trenches. Water bottles froze completely. Canteens turned into blocks of ice. Even the food was starting to harden. The bread would get so frozen that it had to be broken open with knives or rifle butts. The soldiers began to realize something unsettling. The enemy was not just the Soviet army. It was winter itself. Weapons also began to suffer from the cold. Lubricants used in rifles and machine guns began to thicken and freeze. In some cases, soldiers had to completely disassemble and clean the weapons to be able to fire them again. Truck and tanker engines were also beginning to experience problems. Oil would freeze inside the engines overnight. By morning, many vehicles simply wouldn't start. Crews were forced to improvise desperate solutions. Some soldiers lit small fires under the engines to warm the metal before attempting to start them. Others used blankets or tarpaulins to cover the vehicles overnight, trying to preserve some heat. But that was only the beginning. The more experienced soldiers began to hear stories from local farmers and some veterans who knew the Russian climate. Stories of temperatures that could reach 40 degrees below zero. Stories of men freezing to death during the night. Stories of rifles shattering like glass due to the extreme cold. Many German soldiers listened to these stories with disbelief. They seemed like exaggerations. But as the icy wind continued to blow across the plains and snow slowly began to cover the battlefield, a reality began to become impossible to ignore. The real winter hadn't even started yet, and he was already killing men. The night that frozen living men. When winter finally set in completely, the nights on the Eastern Front transformed into something many German soldiers would never forget for the rest of their lives. The cold, which had once been merely uncomfortable, now became a brutal and relentless force, capable of killing silently. During the day it was still possible to move around, to march, to dig trenches, to try to keep the body warm through constant work. But when the sun disappeared on the horizon and darkness covered the frozen plains of Soviet Union, the situation changed completely. The temperature was plummeting. On many nights, the thermometer dropped to 30 degrees below zero or even lower. The wind swept across the open fields like an invisible blade, cutting through any exposed skin. The air was so cold that breathing deeply made your chest ache. For thousands of German soldiers scattered across shallow trenches, makeshift holes, or open positions, the night became a battle for survival. Sentinels were positioned around the posts to watch for possible Soviet attacks. These men had to remain motionless for long periods, observing the white darkness of the snow-covered landscape. But standing still in that cold was almost a death sentence. The human body needs movement to generate heat. When a soldier stood still for too long, the cold would slowly begin to invade his body. First, his fingers would go numb. Then his feet would begin to lose feeling inside his boots, which had become stiff with ice. Some tried stamping their feet on the ground or rubbing their hands together to keep the circulation going. But the cold always seemed to win. There were nights when soldiers would return to change the guard and find their comrade completely motionless. At first, they thought he had fallen asleep. Then they realized that something was wrong. The man did not answer. His body was stiff. Her frozen eyes remained open, staring into the dark void of the night. He had died right there, frozen in his sentry position. These silent deaths began to become increasingly common. In some cases, soldiers would wake up in the morning and discover that the comrade next to them, with whom they had shared a piece of bread hours before, was dead. The cold had taken his life during the night. The bodies often froze so quickly that they became as hard as stone. Arms and legs remained, exactly in the position in which the man had died. Some soldiers reported that it was necessary to use tools or even break the ice around the bodies to remove them from the trenches. Sleeping also became extremely dangerous. Without proper sleeping bags or thermal clothing, many soldiers simply lay down on the frozen ground. Some tried digging small holes in the snow or using straw found in abandoned barns to create a layer of insulation. Others squeezed themselves inside trucks or makeshift shelters made of wood and tarpaulin, but the cold always found a way to get in. During the early morning hours, ice formed inside the trenches themselves. Blankets stiffened with the frozen moisture. Soldiers' mustaches and eyebrows became covered in ice crystals formed by their breath. Even the weapons became too cold to touch without gloves. In many positions, small fires were lit to try to create some warmth, but this was also risky. The light could give away the position to enemy patrols or Soviet snipers hidden in the forests. So many soldiers had to choose, freeze in the dark or risk death under enemy fire. The psychological effect of those nights was devastating. Exhausted men tried to sleep, knowing they might not wake up in the morning. Others simply couldn't close their eyes, fearing that sleep meant the end. Some soldiers began writing letters home, describing the cold as an invisible enemy. An enemy that made no noise, fired no weapons, but killed slowly, night after night. What made it all the more frightening was that this was happening even before winter reached its most extreme point. The cold was about to get even worse, much worse. The invisible enemy, freeze. As the weeks passed, the German soldiers began to realize that the cold didn't just kill at night. It also slowly destroyed the men's bodies, piece by piece. A new enemy began to appear in all the units, frostbite. At first, it seemed like a minor issue. One soldier complained that he could no longer feel his toes. Another said his feet were numb inside his boots. Many thought it was just part of the normal discomfort of fighting in a harsh winter. But it soon became clear that it was much more serious. The extreme cold caused the blood to circulate less and less to the extremities of the body. Fingers, toes, ears and nose were the first parts to suffer. The skin was beginning to lose its natural color, turning white or pale gray. Then came the pain, an intense, deep pain, as if thousands of needles were piercing the flesh. After that came the worst stage. The pain simply disappeared. When this happened, it was a terrible sign. It meant that the nerves were already dying. The skin would begin to darken, taking on bluish or blackish tones. The frozen tissue literally began to die. In a short time, many soldiers could no longer move their fingers. The boots became veritable traps. During the day, the snow melted slightly inside them. At night, this moisture froze again, creating a rigid layer of ice around their feet. Some men spent entire days unable to change their socks or dry their boots. When they finally removed the shoes, they discovered something terrifying. Black skin, stiff fingers, dead meat. Field medics began receiving an increasing number of soldiers wounded not by bullets or shrapnel, but by the cold. Makeshift medical posts were filled with men whose hands and feet were destroyed by frostbite. Many arrived begging for help, but the options were few. In just that brutal environment of the Eastern Front, there were no adequate hospitals or sufficient medical equipment. Doctors had to work in abandoned huts, barns, or makeshift tents, often with little light and limited instruments. When a limb was completely frozen, there was no cure. The only solution was amputation. Surgical knives, medical saws, and even improvised tools were used to remove fingers, hands, or feet that no longer had blood circulation. Some soldiers were held down by their comrades, while the medic performed the procedure quickly, often without sufficient anesthesia. The screams could be heard from outside the medical posts. Even those who survived the procedure knew their lives as soldiers were over. Many would be sent back home mutilated, forever bearing the scars of that winter. Others didn't even manage to survive. Infections were common. Without adequate antibiotics or ideal sanitary conditions, open wounds could quickly become fatal. Meanwhile, on the front lines, soldiers were desperately trying to avoid freezing to death. Some wrapped extra pieces of cloth around their feet. Others tried stuffing paper, straw, or any insulating material inside their boots. Makeshift gloves were made from fabrics found in abandoned villages. But these solutions were rarely sufficient. The cold always seemed to find a way to penetrate any makeshift shelter. With each passing day, more men were being withdrawn from the front lines, not because of the Soviet enemy, but because of the winter itself. The most frightening thing was realizing that this invisible enemy could not be fought with rifles, tanks, or artillery. There was no way to shoot against the cold. There was no way to defend yourself against him. He was simply everywhere. In the wind, in the snow, in the frozen metal of weapons, in the hard earth beneath our feet. And slowly, silently, it continued to destroy the German army man by man. Weapons and machines that died in the cold as winter brutally progressed. German soldiers began to realize that it wasn't just their bodies being ravaged by the cold. The war machines themselves, the very ones that had crushed entire armies in Western Europe, were now beginning to fail in terrifying ways. Modern technology simply wasn't designed to withstand such extreme temperatures. In the first weeks of intense cold, the problems began almost discreetly. A truck that took longer to start in the morning. A tank that needed several attempts before the engine finally roared to life with a heavy rumble. A machine gun that seemed to fire more slowly. But as the cold continued to descend on the plains of Soviet Union. However, these small problems began to turn into serious flaws. The engine simply stopped working. The oil inside the engines would begin to thicken until it turned into something resembling frozen grease. During the night, when temperatures dropped even further, the oil practically solidified inside the mechanical systems. In the morning, when soldiers tried to start the trucks or tanks, often the engine wouldn't even turn over. It was as if the entire machine had been frozen from the inside. Entire crews spent hours trying to get the engines running. Some men used hand cranks to try and manually turn the mechanical systems. Others pushed heavy vehicles in a desperate attempt to start them moving. Often, nothing worked. Then desperate improvisations would emerge. Soldiers began lighting small fires under the engines of vehicles during the early morning hours. The idea was to heat the metal and melt the frozen oil inside the engine. In some cases, this worked. In many others, the excessive heat ended up damaging sensitive parts or creating new mechanical problems. Even when they managed to start the engines, another challenge arose. The fuel also suffered from the extreme cold. At very low temperatures, certain types of fuel would begin to thicken or even partially crystallize inside the tanks and pipes. This hindered the flow to the engine and caused vehicles to misfire or lose power, but the problems didn't stop with the vehicles. The soldiers' weapons also began to suffer. Rifles, pistols, and machine guns relied on moving parts lubricated with special oils. These lubricants worked perfectly in normal climates, but in the Soviet winter, they transformed into something completely different. The oil was freezing. This caused internal parts to simply stop moving. Many soldiers would pull the trigger of their rifles only to find that the weapon wouldn't fire. In other cases, the weapon would fire once and then jam completely. Heavy machine guns, which were supposed to provide constant cover on the battlefield, often froze mid-fire. Some soldiers began trying to solve the problem by completely cleaning the oil from the weapons, leaving the parts practically dry. This helped a little, but created another risk: accelerated wear of the metal parts. Even so, many preferred to take that risk, rather than have a weapon that simply wouldn't work when the enemy appeared. Tanks also began to suffer in unexpected ways. The metal conveyor belts stiffened in the extreme cold. Hydraulic systems operated slowly. Some metal parts became so brittle that they could break under pressure. Crews reported that when attempting to maneuver the tanks over frozen terrain, certain parts would simply shatter like glass. For an army that relied heavily on mobility and speed, these mechanical failures were devastating. Armored vehicles that should have been advancing rapidly were now stuck or abandoned on the frozen roads. Trucks loaded with supplies were stalled in the middle of nowhere. Heavy artillery could not be quickly repositioned. The mighty German war machine, which had surged across Europe like a storm of steel, now seemed to be slowly paralyzed by an invisible enemy: the cold. Meanwhile, Soviet soldiers seemed to cope better with those conditions. Much of their equipment had been designed with that kind of brutal winter in mind. For the Germans, each passing day made one thing increasingly clear: they weren't just fighting against the Soviet army, they were fighting against a climate that seemed determined to destroy everything: men, weapons and machines. Frozen horses on the roads. Despite the image of a modern army full of tanks and armored vehicles, much of German logistics still depended on something much older: horses. Thousands upon thousands of them accompanied the division's Wehrmacht, pulling supply wagons, heavy artillery cannons, and wagons loaded with ammunition, food, and fuel. At the start of the campaign, during the summer of 1941, these animals had been essential in keeping the army moving. While the tanks advanced on the front lines, it was the horses that ensured ammunition and equipment reached the soldiers. But when the Soviet winter descended upon the battlefield, these animals began to suffer brutally. The extreme cold was unforgiving. Horses were forced to march for miles in temperatures well below freezing, often pulling extremely heavy loads through deep snow or frozen ground. Their breath formed dense clouds of vapor in the frigid air, and the sweat that formed during the exertion quickly froze on their bodies. Without adequate shelter and with little food available, many of these animals began to weaken rapidly. Hunger was a constant problem. Just like the soldiers, the horses depended on supplies that came from far away. With the logistical lines increasingly stretched within the territory of Soviet Union, the supply of feed began to decrease drastically. Many horses received only small amounts of food per day. Some were beginning to chew on pieces of wood, leather, or anything they could find on the frozen ground. Others simply grew weaker and weaker, unable to keep pace with the military columns. On the snow-covered roads, increasingly common scenes began to appear. Horses slipped on frozen surfaces while pulling heavy cannons. When an animal fell, the weight of the artillery often dragged it along the ground. Soldiers rushed to try to lift the animal, shouting orders and pulling on the reins. But often it was already too late. Exhausted, frozen, or injured, many of these horses simply could no longer get up. When this happened, the soldiers had few options. Sometimes they tried to lighten the load by removing equipment from the cart or cannon. On other occasions, they simply cut the harnesses and moved on, abandoning the animal to its fate. Some horses died right there, lying in the snow, breathing slower and slower until their bodies finally stopped. Others froze overnight. As the weeks passed, the roads of the Eastern Front began to transform into veritable animal cemeteries. Frozen horse carcasses lay scattered along the advance routes. Some were partially covered by snow. Others remained stiff, their eyes open, like tragic statues of a war that seemed to devour everything in its path. These carcasses often remained there for weeks or even months, as the frozen ground made it impossible to bury them. In some areas, the number of dead animals was so great that the soldiers literally had to walk around piles of frozen bodies to continue marching. The smell was also something hard to forget. During the rare moments when the temperature rose slightly, the bodies would begin to partially thaw, releasing a strong odor that spread along the roads. But for soldiers already facing constant hunger, even these carcasses sometimes became a source of survival. In extreme situations, some men would cut pieces of meat from dead horses to cook over small makeshift fires. That tough, often frozen meat was all they had to eat. It was a brutal reminder that in that war everything was being consumed, men, machines and animals. The Soviet winter made no distinction. Everything exposed to him would eventually pay a price. The hunger that began to consume the soldiers as winter continued to tighten its icy grip on the Eastern Front. A new enemy began to emerge in the German ranks. A silent enemy, one that made no sound of gunfire or explosions, but slowly weakened every man on the battlefield: hunger. At the start of the invasion months earlier, the German army had advanced rapidly, believing it could partially live off resources captured in enemy territory. Many military planners imagined that Soviet cities, villages and agricultural depots would provide enough food to sustain the troops. But the reality turned out to be completely different. As the army advanced deeper into the Soviet Union, the Soviet strategy of destroying resources before retreating began to show its devastating effects. Granaries had been set on fire, the warehouses were empty, agricultural fields had been burned or abandoned. What German soldiers often found was nothing but scorched earth. With supply lines stretching for hundreds and even thousands of kilometers, getting enough food to the front lines became a gigantic challenge. Trucks got stuck in the snow or broke down along the way. Trains couldn't reach many areas because of destroyed tracks. The results started showing up in the soldiers' backpacks. The daily rations began to decrease. What was once a reasonable portion of bread, canned meat and hot soup slowly began to transform into small amounts of food that could barely sustain a man in combat. Many soldiers began receiving only pieces of stale bread, some frozen potatoes or small portions of meat, and even that often arrived frozen, bread turned into blocks as hard as stone. To eat, soldiers had to break it with knives or bang the bread against the metal of their weapons to break it into pieces. Frozen meat had to be heated directly over a fire before it could be chewed, but there wasn't always a fire. In positions close to the enemy, lighting a fire could reveal the unit's location. So many men simply ate cold, frozen food, struggling to chew as the icy wind blew across the battlefield. As the weeks passed, hunger began to alter the soldiers' behavior. Men who once marched with energy now moved slowly, with pale faces and weakened bodies. Some lost weight rapidly. Their cheeks became sunken, their eyes sunken, and their uniforms began to seem too large for their bodies. The energy needed to fight, dig trenches or carry equipment simply vanished. In many units, soldiers began searching for food on their own. Patrols were sent to abandoned villages in the hope of finding any kind of food. Sometimes they discovered small stockpiles hidden by Soviet peasants, sacks of potatoes, flour or vegetables stored in cellars. When they found something, it was treated like a real treasure, but most of the time there was nothing. In extreme situations, some soldiers began eating things they would normally never consider. Meat from horses killed on the roads was cut up and taken back to the camps. Even frozen and tough it could be, cooked into makeshift soups. Others tried to hunt small animals in the nearby forests, rabbits, birds, or any creature that still survived in that brutal environment. But hunting was also scarce. The extreme cold had driven away many animals, and those that remained were difficult to find in the vast expanse of snow-covered forests. Hunger began to become a constant presence in the soldiers' minds. Letters sent home frequently mentioned food. Some men wrote lengthy descriptions of simple meals. They had eaten before the war. Others said they dreamed of fresh bread or hot soup, but in the reality of the Eastern Front, those dreams seemed increasingly distant. With their bodies weakened by the cold and lack of food, many soldiers began to notice something terrifying. They were fighting not only against an armed enemy and against the brutal winter. Now they were also fighting against hunger. And hunger, like the cold, was an enemy that never stopped attacking. The villages that became shelters. As winter progressed and temperatures continued to drop across the vast plains of Soviet Union, German soldiers began to understand that remaining outdoors overnight could mean a slow and silent death. The shallow trenches dug into the frozen ground no longer offered sufficient protection against the biting wind and extreme temperatures. Then a desperate solution emerged. The small Soviet villages scattered throughout the countryside became makeshift shelters for the troops. These villages consisted mainly of simple wooden houses, often built with thick logs and sloping roofs covered in snow. During the summer and autumn, many of these villages had been hastily abandoned by their inhabitants, who fled before the advancing German troops or were evacuated by the Soviet authorities. When the German units arrived, they found silent streets and empty houses, open doors, broken windows, tables still covered with objects left behind. To soldiers freezing in the open field, those simple structures seemed almost a miracle. Once they occupied a village, the men quickly spread out among the available houses. There was no formal organization. Each group tried to find the safest and warmest shelter possible. Inside the houses, the first task was to light a fire. Soldiers smashed furniture, ripped up planks from the ground, or dismantled outside fences to use as firewood. Old iron stoves were relit after being extinguished for weeks or months. Soon, small columns of smoke began to rise from the chimneys of these occupied villages. For the first time in days, or even weeks, many soldiers were able to feel some real warmth. The interiors of these houses quickly filled with men. Small rooms that would normally house an entire family were now crammed with 10, 15, or even 20 soldiers, trying to get as close as possible to the heat source. Some sat directly on the ground. Others slept leaning against the walls or lying on straw found in nearby barns. Wet uniforms were hung near the fire to dry. Boots were placed around the stove in an attempt to thaw the ice that had accumulated inside them. Many soldiers reached out their hands toward the flames, feeling the intense pain that came as frozen fingers slowly began to regain circulation. But even in those moments of relative comfort, war was never truly far away. These villages were often located near the front line. At night, soldiers could still hear the distant echo of artillery or stray shots coming from the forests. There was also the constant fear of surprise attacks. Soviet patrols would sometimes approach these occupied villages. Small groups of Soviet soldiers knew the terrain well and could suddenly emerge from the darkness, attacking German positions before disappearing again into the snow. Therefore, even while some soldiers slept inside the heated houses, others had to remain outside, standing guard in the silent streets of the village. The contrast was brutal. Inside the houses, heat, smoke, and the smell of burning wood. Outside, the freezing wind blew through the snow-covered streets. Another problem was also beginning to emerge. With so many troops occupying the same villages, available resources quickly ran out. Firewood became scarce. The little food found in the houses disappeared within hours. Some villages ended up being completely destroyed just to provide fuel for the bonfires. Entire houses were dismantled, board by board, to keep the soldiers warm for a few more nights. In many places, when German units finally left these villages to continue advancing or repositioning, little remained but burned structures and streets covered in ash. Even so, for many soldiers, these villages represented something extremely valuable. They offered a few hours of warmth, a few hours of rest, a few hours when winter seemed a little less deadly. But everyone knew that sooner or later they would need to leave those shelters behind and return to the open countryside. And outside, the Soviet winter continued to wait. The Soviet soldier prepared for winter. While German soldiers desperately fought to survive the cold, something began to become increasingly evident on the battlefield. The enemy seemed far better prepared for that brutal environment. The soldiers of Red Army, they were used to the winter of Soviet Union. For many of them, especially those from northern regions and Siberia, extremely low temperatures were no surprise. They were a normal part of life. And that made a huge difference in the war. While the Germans still wore relatively light uniforms, Soviet soldiers appeared wearing thick winter coats made of heavy wool. Some wore long military overcoats that protected their entire bodies against the icy wind. But the detail that most caught the attention of the Germans was the boots. Many Soviet soldiers wore the famous felt boots, known as valenki. These boots were specially made to withstand extremely low temperatures. Unlike German leather boots, which often froze or became soaked, these boots insulated the feet much better from the cold. Also common were thick fur hats with brims that covered the ears, the traditional caps that protected the head and face from the freezing wind. These clothes made a huge difference. Soviet soldiers were able to remain in open fields for much longer without suffering severe frostbite. They also moved more easily through deep snow, something the Germans often had difficulty doing. Another element that surprised the German soldiers was the mobility of the Soviet troops in winter. In many regions covered in deep snow, Soviet units used skis to move quickly through forests and fields. These skiing soldiers could suddenly appear in areas where the Germans believed they were safe. German patrols frequently reported the same terrifying experience. Absolute silence in the white landscape. Then, suddenly, figures would rapidly emerge from among the snow-covered trees. Soviet soldiers moving with ease. On skis, attacking quickly and disappearing back into the forest before an organized response could occur. For exhausted, frozen, and often starving German soldiers, this type of attack seemed almost supernatural. But it wasn't just equipment that made the Soviets more prepared. Many of them had real experience surviving extremely harsh winters. They knew how to build makeshift shelters in the snow, how to keep warm in extreme conditions, and how to avoid freezing. They also knew how to use winter itself as a weapon. Attacks were often planned to take place during snowstorms or periods of intense cold, when the Germans were most vulnerable. Strong winds and moving snow hampered visibility and the effective use of long-range weapons. Under these conditions, the Soviets were able to get much closer to enemy positions. For the Germans, this created a growing sense of disadvantage. They were fighting in an environment they didn't fully understand, against an enemy that seemed almost a natural part of that brutal climate. Increasingly, reports from the front lines described the same reality. Soviet soldiers seemed to emerge from the snow itself. They moved confidently across the frozen ground. They attacked quickly, and they would disappear again into the white landscape before the Germans could react. For many men in the Wehrmacht, that war was beginning to look very different from the quick campaign they had imagined months before. Now, each winter day seemed to transform Soviet territory itself into a powerful ally of Red Army, and the worst was yet to come. The counterattack that came with the blizzard. By the end of 1941, winter had completely engulfed the battlefield. The plains were covered in thick layers of snow, the forests seemed silent and frozen, and the wind cut like invisible blades through the German trenches scattered across the territory. Soviet Union. But while many German soldiers believed that the extreme cold would slow the pace of the war, something completely different was about to happen. The Soviets were preparing to attack. Deep within Soviet territory, new divisions were being organized. Among them were troops from extremely cold regions of the country, especially Siberia. These soldiers had grown up and trained in environments where temperatures of 40 degrees below zero were not uncommon. They were used to that icy world. These troops were part of Red Army. They were brought together to launch a massive counteroffensive that would catch the Germans completely off guard. In early December 1941, while many German units were still struggling to keep their equipment running and their men warm, the attack finally began. And he came along with the snow. Major winter storms began to sweep across the region. Visibility was extremely low. The wind whipped up clouds of snow that seemed to completely engulf the battlefield. It was precisely at this moment that the Soviets advanced. Suddenly, German positions began to hear strange sounds coming from the snowstorm. At first it was just a distant noise, something like footsteps crunching snow. Then the first shadows appeared in the white storm. Columns of Soviet soldiers advancing rapidly through the deep snow. Some came on foot, others glided on skis, moving at a speed that the Germans could barely keep up with. Soon after, the silence of the frozen landscape was broken by the sound of gunfire. Soviet machine guns began firing. Grenades exploded in the German trenches. Shouts echoed through the storm as entire units tried to organize a defense. For many German soldiers, it looked like a nightmare emerging from the snow itself. The problem was that many German positions were in terrible condition to withstand a large-scale attack. Men were exhausted, frozen, and often malnourished, weapons jammed in the cold, vehicles couldn't move quickly. Meanwhile, the Soviet soldiers advanced with renewed energy. They attacked in successive waves, pressing the German lines at several points simultaneously. In some regions, the fighting took place hand-to-hand within snow-covered forests or in villages devastated by the cold and the war. The white snow was quickly beginning to be stained red. In certain areas, German units were completely taken by surprise. Trenches were breached, artillery positions captured, and defensive lines began to crumble. For soldiers who months earlier had advanced almost non-stop through Eastern Europe, this situation was shocking. Now, they were the ones being pushed back. The Soviet attack was not just a military counter-coup. It was a clear sign that the war in the East was changing. The winter, which was already destroying German men and machines, now served as perfect cover for the advance of Red Army. And in that snowstorm, many German soldiers began to realize a terrifying reality. They were no longer making progress. Now they were fighting desperately just to survive. Tanks trapped in ice and snow during the first months of the invasion. German tanks had been the symbol of the army's speed and strength. These steel machines advanced rapidly through roads and fields, breaking through enemy lines and clearing a path for the infantry. German strategy depended heavily on this brutal mobility, known as Blitzkrieg. But in the winter of Soviet Union, even these powerful machines began to lose their strength. Deep snow and ice transformed the terrain into a true nightmare for armored vehicles. Many roads simply disappeared under thick layers of hardened snow. Fields that once allowed for quick maneuvers were now covered in patchy ice and frozen mounds that hampered any movement. The tanks tried to advance but frequently got stuck. The tracks spun endlessly, throwing snow and ice everywhere, but the vehicle simply wouldn't move. The more the driver tried to accelerate, the deeper the tank sank into the compacted snow or the frozen ground beneath it. Crews were forced to exit the vehicles and begin digging around the tracks using shovels and even improvised pieces of metal. They often did this in extremely low temperatures, with biting wind and snow blowing across their faces. Thick gloves made the work difficult, but removing the gloves meant exposing their skin directly to the brutal cold. Even when they managed to free the tank, new problems arose. The engines remained extremely sensitive to freezing temperatures. Overnight, the metal would cool down so much that starting the engine in the morning became a difficult task. In some cases, the system simply refused to function. Crews would spend hours trying to warm up the engines before they could move the vehicle. Some men lit fires under the tank, trying to slowly warm the metal parts and the frozen oil. Others covered parts of the engine with tarpaulins and makeshift blankets to try to preserve what little heat remained. Even so, many tanks simply never worked again. Heavy artillery faced similar difficulties. Cannons mounted on mobile platforms or towed by vehicles often became stuck on icy roads. Without mobility, these weapons became easy targets for Soviet attacks. In various regions along the battlefront, an increasingly common scene began to emerge. Abandoned armored vehicles. German tanks lay stranded on the roads, partially covered by snow. Some were intact, but with engines completely rendered unusable by the cold. Others had been damaged during combat or simply left behind because there was no fuel or spare parts. To the soldiers who passed through these frozen routes, these abandoned machines seemed like defeated giants, silent steel monsters, frozen in the middle of the white landscape. In some areas, the Soviets used these abandoned vehicles as makeshift shelters or even as temporary defensive positions. For the German army, every tank lost was a severe blow. These machines were difficult to replace and essential for any attempt to maintain the initiative on the battlefield. But Winter didn't seem to care about that. He turned advanced technology into useless metal, and as more and more armored vehicles became stuck or abandoned on frozen roads, German soldiers began to realize that something fundamental was changing in that war. The speed that had guaranteed so many victories at the start of the campaign was fading. Now, in the deep snow and extreme cold, even the tanks were being defeated. The moral collapse on the German lines. As the winter months passed, something began to break down within the German lines. It wasn't just the equipment that was failing, nor just the bodies that were weakening from the cold and hunger. It was the spirit of the men. At the start of the campaign, many soldiers believed they were participating in a quick war when they crossed the border of Soviet Union during the invasion known as Operation Barbarossa. The expectation was that the campaign would end even before winter arrived. Now, months later, that illusion had completely vanished. The men were exhausted. Days and nights passed without real rest. The constant cold drained the body's energy. Hunger weakened the muscles. The fear of freezing during the night or being attacked during a snowstorm kept everyone in a permanent state of tension. Some soldiers began to show clear signs of mental exhaustion. They would remain silent for long periods, staring at the white horizon without saying a word. Others would have sudden outbursts of anger or despair. Minor arguments between companions could escalate into violent fights. Winter seemed to slowly crush the minds of men. Letters sent home began to reflect this change. Many soldiers wrote to their families describing the cold as something almost impossible to explain. They said they were not only fighting a human enemy, but nature itself. Some wrote short, almost desperate sentences. "It's not a war. It's a fight for survival." Others described the constant fear of falling asleep and not waking up in the morning. Each night felt like a gamble against the cold. Death was also becoming increasingly present around them. Bodies of frozen soldiers, comrades injured by frostbite, dead horses on the roads, and abandoned vehicles formed a scene that seemed ever more desperate. This reality began to profoundly affect the morale of the troops. Men who had once marched confidently now moved slowly, their shoulders hunched and their eyes weary. Many no longer believed in the promise of a quick victory. Some began to silently question how this war could end. But in a disciplined army like that of Wehrmacht, however, openly expressing doubts or discouragement could be dangerous. So many soldiers simply kept their thoughts to themselves. They just kept marching. They continued fighting. They continued to survive from one day to the next. The worst part was that the situation seemed endless. Winter was far from over. The enemy continued to attack, and living conditions on the front remained brutal. For many men, the war in the East had ceased to be just a military campaign. She had transformed into something much darker. A daily struggle against the cold, against hunger, against fear, and against the slow erosion of hope itself. And when an army begins to lose hope, something very dangerous begins to happen. The collapse is no longer just physical, he becomes moral. The winter that shattered the myth of German invincibility. When spring finally began to approach in 1942, the scene left by winter on the Eastern Front was devastating. Months of brutal cold had transformed the battlefield into a vast graveyard of men, animals, and machines. Snow still covered much of the plains. Soviet Union. But slowly the ice began to give way in some places. Small rivers flowed again beneath the layers of cracked ice. The wind was still cold, but it no longer had the same deadly force as on the deepest winter nights. For many German soldiers who survived, it seemed almost unbelievable that they were still alive. The winter had left deep marks on the entire army of Wehrmacht. Thousands of men had died not only in combat, but also frozen in trenches, on roads, or during grueling marches through the snow. Thousands more were evacuated with severe frostbite injuries, amputated hands, lost feet, fingers destroyed by the extreme cold. In makeshift hospitals behind the front lines, doctors were still treating soldiers who would never see the fight again. But the losses were not only human. Along the frozen roads and fields, destroyed or abandoned vehicles remained as silent reminders of that brutal winter. Trucks without engines, tanks trapped in the ice, and abandoned artillery showed the price the war had exacted from the powerful German military machine. The army that had crossed Europe with impressive speed was now deeply exhausted. When the invasion known as Operation Barbarossa began in 1941, and many German leaders believed that the Soviet Union would fall within a few months. The plan was to destroy the enemy before winter had any influence on the war. But winter has arrived, and he changed everything. The German offensives were halted. The seemingly unstoppable advance came to a halt in the face of Soviet resistance and extreme weather conditions. Positions had to be abandoned. Improvised defensive lines were created to try and contain counterattacks. Red Army. For the first time since the start of the war, the German army had been forced to retreat on a large scale. For the entire world, that had enormous significance. Until then, the forces of Adolf Hitler, they seemed virtually invincible. Country after country had fallen before the German military might. The idea that Germany could be stopped seemed almost impossible, but the Soviet winter showed something different. He revealed that the German army was not invincible. The combination of Soviet resistance, immense distances, and a brutal winter had broken the rhythm of the German offensive. That quick war the generals had promised simply no longer existed. It was now clear that the conflict in the east would be long, extremely long. It's extremely bloody. For the soldiers who had survived that first winter, war would never be seen in the same way again. They had faced something that went far beyond an armed enemy. They had faced cold that froze men alive. Hunger was slowly consuming his body. The snow that concealed deadly attacks. And the brutal reality of a war that seemed to have no end. The Soviet winter didn't just kill thousands of soldiers. He shattered an illusion. The illusion that the war would be quick,